The night before her wedding, Sophia Whitmore stood alone by a narrow window and wondered if her life was ending or just beginning. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass as if trying to warn her. Inside, the candle beside her shook, its flame weak but stubborn, much like her own heart. In less than 12 hours, she would belong to a man she had never met, a duke, a stranger. A fate decided without her voice. England, 1848. Sophia was only 20, yet grief had aged her far beyond her years. 6 years earlier, a sickness had swept through her childhood home and taken everything that had ever loved her without condition. Her parents were gone. The laughter in the halls of Whitmore Manor was gone. Even the land itself had slipped from her hands like sand through open fingers. What remained of her life now belonged to relatives who spoke of duty but practiced convenience. Lord and Lady Ashford had taken her in, not out of love, but obligation. Their house was large, proper, and cold in ways that went deeper than winter. Sophia lived in a small room at the top of the house, far from the warmth of the family spaces below. At meals, she sat quietly, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. Gratitude was expected. Silence was rewarded. Over the years, Sophia learned how to disappear without leaving a room, yet time had a cruel sense of irony. The same years that stripped her of family also gave her something else: beauty. Not the loud kind that demanded attention, but a quiet one that lingered. Her hair turned the color of warm honey under the sun. Her eyes held a green depth that made people pause without knowing why. And beneath it all, she carried herself with a grace that could not be taught. That grace became her price. The decision was made on a rainy afternoon while Sophia passed her uncle's study carrying tea. She heard her name spoken in low voices. She slowed without meaning to. "The Duke needs a wife," Lord Ashford said. "Alexander Peton, 45, widower, powerful, and desperate for an heir," Lady Ashford replied. "What of the settlement? He is offering more than enough to solve our troubles." Sophia's fingers tightened around the tray. Her future was being traded like property. That evening, she was summoned. Lord Ashford did not ask her to sit. He told her the truth plainly, as one might explain weather. "You will marry the Duke of Ravenshollow in September." Sophia waited for the moment when her opinion might matter. It never came. "I do not know him," she said quietly. "You will," her uncle replied, "in marriage." There was no anger in his voice, no cruelty, just certainty. Sophia understood then that pleading would only humiliate her. She nodded once, the way she had learned to nod when resistance was useless. That night, she cried for the first time in years. The Duke of Ravenshollow did not know her tears existed. Alexander Peton stood at a tall window in his London residence, watching the city move without him. At 45, he had learned how to exist without needing warmth. His life was built on responsibility, order, and control. Emotion had never been part of the design. His first marriage had taught him that love was optional and disappointment was permanent. When his wife died, the house had gone quiet, but his heart had already been so for years. Still, a duke without an heir was a problem that could not be ignored. When his solicitor presented Sophia Whitmore's name, Alexander hesitated. She was young, too young, but she was also unentangled. No ambition, no scandal, no expectations, a suitable solution. He agreed without ever seeing her face. The wedding day arrived beneath gray skies. St. Mary's Church stood old and solemn, its stone walls bearing witness to unions of duty long before Sophia was born. Inside, candles flickered as guests whispered behind gloved hands. Sophia walked down the aisle on her uncle's arm, every step echoing like a farewell. Her white dress felt heavy, though it was light as air. She did not look at the guests. She looked only at the floor until she reached the altar. Then she looked up. The Duke was taller than she imagined, broad-shouldered, still. His expression was unreadable, carved in calm lines. But when his eyes met hers, something unexpected happened. He softened, just slightly. Enough for her to notice. Their vows were spoken clearly, calmly. two voices promising a life neither had chosen. When the moment came, Alexander hesitated before kissing her, not from uncertainty, but respect. The kiss was brief and careful, yet Sophia felt her breath catch. She did not understand why. The journey north lasted days. They spoke politely, like strangers sharing a waiting room. Books, weather, landscapes passing by the windows, but there was no silence heavy with fear, only distance, filled with courtesy. When Peton Hall rose before her at last, Sophia felt small again. The house was vast, imposing and beautiful, in a way that did not invite comfort. Servants lined the entrance. Heads bowed, titles spoken. Her new rooms were large enough to swallow her old life whole. That evening, Alexander surprised her. "I will not force anything," he said, standing by the door. "This marriage will move at your pace." Sophia had expected obligation. She received kindness instead. It unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. Days passed, weeks. They walked the gardens, shared meals, sat across from one another in the library. Slowly, without announcing it, the walls shifted. Sophia began to see the man beneath the title, a man who cared deeply for his lands, who spoke of responsibility with quiet passion, who listened when she spoke, truly listened. Alexander began to notice her silences, the way her eyes lingered on windows, how she flinched at raised voices, how her laughter, when it came, felt like a rare gift. One stormy night she woke shaking for memories she could not outrun. Without thinking, she wandered into a small parlor lit by firelight. She was not alone. Alexander stood there, sleepless as well. "May I stay?" he asked softly. She nodded. They spoke of loss, of loneliness, of the emptiness that can exist even inside grand houses. And in that quiet space between words, something fragile took shape. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. Sophia returned to her room that night with a feeling she had not carried in years. Hope. And somewhere deep within Peton Hall, the Duke of Ravenshollow began to realize that this marriage of duty might demand more of his heart than he had ever intended to give. The question was no longer whether they could live together. It was whether they dared to become more than strangers bound by a contract. Winter settled over Ravenshollow with a quiet authority. Snow covered the gardens, softened the sharp lines of the estate, and wrapped Peton Hall in a silence that felt both heavy and protective. For Sophia, the isolation brought an unexpected change. With fewer visitors and fewer expectations, life slowed. And in that slowing, something between her and Alexander began to breathe. They fell into a rhythm without ever naming it. Breakfasts were taken together in a smaller room warmed by morning light. Alexander would read the paper while Sophia poured tea, their movements natural now, no longer careful. In the afternoons, they walked when the weather allowed, their boots leaving parallel tracks in the snow. In the evenings, they shared the library, sometimes reading, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply existing in the same quiet space. Sophia noticed things she had not seen before. How Alexander removed his gloves before touching books as if they deserved bare hands. How he listened with his whole body, turning fully toward her when she spoke. How his reserve was not coldness, but restraint shaped by years of solitude. Alexander noticed her strength, the way she never complained, even when the weight of her new role pressed heavily on her shoulders. The care she showed to the servants, remembering names, asking after families. The intelligence beneath her soft voice revealed when she spoke of poetry or land management with thoughtful clarity. One evening, as the fire cracked low and the wind pressed against the windows, Alexander broke a silence that had grown comfortable. "Do you regret marrying me?" he asked. Sophia looked up from her book, surprised not by the question, but by the vulnerability behind it. "I feared it," she said honestly, "but regret is not the same as fear." He nodded, absorbing her words. "I feared becoming what I already was," he admitted. A man who lived beside another without ever reaching her. Their eyes held. The space between them felt smaller than the length of the room suggested. From that night on, something changed. Alexander began using her name more often. Sophia, not Duchess, not my wife, just Sophia. Each time, it felt like an offering. She responded in kind, calling him Alexander instead of Your Grace when they were alone. The title felt unnecessary now, almost intrusive. The first time he touched her without reason, it startled them both. They were standing near a window watching snow fall like ash from the sky. Sophia shivered, and without thinking, Alexander placed his coat around her shoulders. His hand brushed her arm. It was brief, accidental. Neither moved away. Sophia felt her breath catch, not from fear but awareness. Alexander withdrew slowly, as if afraid to break something fragile. I should not, he said quietly. I did not mind, she replied. The silence that followed was charged with words neither yet dared to speak. January brought the winter ball, a tradition older than Alexander himself. Sophia dreaded it, the weight of expectation, the scrutiny, the whispers that would follow her every step. She confessed her fear to Alexander on the morning of the event. He listened, then said something she did not expect. Dance only with me tonight. She smiled faintly. That may cause gossip. Let it, he replied. I would rather be talked about than watch you disappear into a room full of strangers. The ball transformed Peton Hall into light and sound. Chandeliers burned bright. Music filled the air. Guests arrived in waves of silk and jewels. When Sophia descended the staircase, Alexander was waiting. For a moment, he forgot how to breathe. She wore deep blue velvet, simple but perfect. Her hair was pinned softly, her eyes steady. She did not look like a girl sold into marriage. She looked like a woman who belonged exactly where she stood. They danced early in the evening. The waltz carried them across the floor, his hand firm at her back, hers resting in his with quiet trust. As they moved, the world fell away.
You are doing wonderfully, he murmured.
I am only following you, she replied. And I am honored, he said. The words stayed with her long after the music ended. Later, as the night deepened, Alexander leaned close and spoke softly. His voice meant only for her. You have brought warmth into this house, he said. I had forgotten it could feel like this. Sophia looked at him, her heart unsteady. So had I. When the last guests left and silence returned, neither wanted the night to end. They lingered by the fire, no longer pretending the closeness was accidental. It was Sophia who spoke first. Alexander, she said, her voice barely above the crackle of the flames, do you believe affection can grow into something more? He turned to her fully. I believe it already has. The words were simple, honest. And they changed everything. Days passed, and restraint grew harder. Their conversations deepened. Their glances lingered. Each brush of hands felt intentional now, though neither crossed the line that remained unspoken. Until the storm. The wind howled through the halls one night, shaking windows, rattling doors. Sophia woke trembling, old memories clawing their way back. Without thought, she wrapped herself in a robe and fled her room. She found Alexander in the west parlor, standing by the window, unable to sleep. He turned as she entered. Sophia. She did not speak. She crossed the room and stopped a few steps away. He saw fear in her eyes and something else beneath it. May I stay? She asked. Yes, he said immediately. She sat. He joined her. Silence stretched, then broke. I still dream of losing everything, she whispered. Of being alone again. Alexander's voice was steady. You are not alone. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and something inside her settled. I trust you, she said. The words struck him with more force than any declaration of love could have. He reached for her hand, slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. Their fingers intertwined, natural and sure. Sophia leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her with reverent care. May I continue? He asked softly. She nodded. The kiss was gentle, unhurried, filled with promise rather than hunger. It spoke of patience, of choice, of two people stepping forward together instead of being pushed. When they parted, neither felt uncertainty, only certainty. From that night on, they were no longer a duke and a duchess sharing a house. They were husband and wife in truth, bound not by obligation, but by the quiet decision to choose one another. Yet neither knew that the world beyond Peton Hall was watching, waiting, and that the greatest test of their love was still to come. Spring arrived slowly at Raven's Hollow, as if the land itself needed time to believe winter had truly ended. Snow retreated from the gardens, revealing dark earth and the first fragile green shoots. For Sophia, the change felt deeper than the seasons. Something inside her had awakened, steady and sure. She no longer woke with fear. She woke with purpose. Alexander noticed it first in the way she moved through the house. Her steps were lighter. Her gaze lifted more often. She spoke with confidence to the staff, offered suggestions, asked questions that showed not only kindness but understanding. She was no longer a guest in Peton Hall. She was its heart. Their marriage changed quietly, without announcement. They shared a bed now, not out of duty, but choice. Nights were gentle, filled with whispered conversations and the warmth of belonging. Alexander treated her with the same care he had shown from the beginning, but now there was affection woven into every gesture. Sophia responded with a tenderness that surprised even herself. She had never known she could be this brave. One morning in March, as sunlight poured through the windows, Sophia felt a strange certainty settle in her body. She said nothing at first. Weeks passed before the doctor confirmed it. She was with child. Alexander listened in silence as the physician spoke, his face unreadable. When the man finally left, Alexander turned to Sophia slowly, as if afraid the moment might shatter. "Are you certain?" he asked softly. She nodded. For the first time since she had known him, Alexander lost his composure. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though the world itself depended on it. "Our child," he said, his voice thick. "We made this." Sophia closed her eyes, overwhelmed not by fear, but by gratitude. News spread through the estate quickly. Servants smiled openly now. The house changed again, this time filled with anticipation. Alexander became fiercely attentive, walking with her daily, insisting she rest, listening to every concern, no matter how small. And then came London. They returned for the season as expected. Balls, dinners, appearances. Sophia carried herself with quiet dignity. Though her body was changing, her strength tested in new ways. Whispers followed her, some kind, some sharp. She ignored them all. At a grand gathering one evening, Alexander did something no one expected. He stood before the assembled aristocracy and spoke with calm authority. "My wife will have full legal control over her property," he said, "and full authority beside me in all matters of this estate." The room froze. Sophia felt the shock ripple outward, felt eyes turn toward her, measuring, judging. She reached for Alexander's hand instinctively. He held it firmly. Later that night, alone, she finally spoke. "You did not need to do that." "Yes," he replied, "I did." He looked at her then, not as a duke defending his decision, but as a man speaking to the woman he loved. "I will never allow this world to make you small again." Tears filled her eyes. "You have already given me more than I believed possible. That is because you deserve more than you were ever given." The months passed, and autumn returned to Raven's Hollow. Sophia's pregnancy was not easy, but it was surrounded by care. Alexander never left her side when he could help it. When labor finally came, he waited outside the room, pacing like a man undone. The cry of a child broke the silence before dawn. "A boy," the midwife announced. Alexander nearly collapsed with relief. When he was finally allowed inside, Sophia lay exhausted but radiant, their son in her arms. Alexander knelt beside the bed, tears unashamed on his face. "Our son," he whispered. They named him Edmund. From the moment he was born, Edmund changed everything. Peton Hall filled with laughter. Alexander proved himself an attentive father, ignoring every rule that suggested distance. Sophia watched him with a love deeper than she thought her heart could hold. Years passed. Another child followed, then another. The house grew warmer, louder, alive in ways neither had imagined when they first stood together at the altar as strangers. Sophia found her voice beyond the walls of her home. She opened a school for orphaned girls, giving them education, dignity, and choice. Alexander supported her fully, proud without restraint. One evening years later, they sat together at Whitmore Cottage, watching their children play in the fading light. "Do you remember the night before our wedding?" Sophia asked softly. Alexander smiled. "You looked as though you were walking toward a storm." And instead, she said, resting her head against his shoulder, "I found a home." He kissed her hair gently. "We found each other," he corrected. Sophia thought of the frightened girl she once was, the contract she had feared, the life she had not chosen, and she understood at last. Love had not arrived as a promise. It had arrived as a choice, chosen again and again until it became everything.